Welcome to True Terror Narrative.
October 9th, 1922. Vermland, Sweden. The train from Karlstad left Johan Lindström at the end of the line just after dawn. From there, a timber wagon carried him 18 kilometers into the ancient forests. The trees grew so close together that even at midday the light felt dim and gray. These were old-growth pines, many over 100 years old. Standing and touched for centuries, the Vermland Timber Company had purchased this tract the previous spring. The company said the wood was exceptional quality. They said many things. The logging camp was already established when Johan arrived. 12 men total, 6 Swedish for a finish. 2 Norwegian, all experienced. Men who knew the forests, men who knew danger, men who did not frighten easily. Johan had worked these woods for 23 years. He knew the sound of wind through pine needles. He knew the crack of ice forming on bark. He knew how snow fell differently depending on temperature. He believed he knew the forests. The work was organized and efficient. They were cutting west to east. Section by section, the quota was clear. 3,000 board feet before the first snow. Hard work, fair pay, nothing unusual. For the first few nights, everything followed the familiar rhythm. Axes during the day, quiet conversations by firelight. Sleep under canvas. No signs of trouble. No warnings that could not be ignored. Then came the first stone. It struck Erik Svensson's tent just after midnight. A sharp crack against canvas, loud enough to wake half the camp. Erik emerged holding his lantern, convinced someone was playing a joke. They found the stone lying in the dirt. Granite, wet with dew, about the size of a man's fist. Nothing remarkable about it, except that it was there at all. Erik pointed toward a rocky outcrop roughly 200 meters north. Frost heave, ground shifting, a natural explanation. Johan logged it as a minor incident. Weather clear, temperature dropping, 1 stone. Probable natural cause, the men returned to their tents. The forest closed in round them, silent and watchful. And somewhere beyond the firelight, something listened. October 14th, 1922. The second stone fell 3 nights later, again after dark, then another the night after that. Always after midnight, always landing close to the tents, never during the day. By the 4th night, the men stopped laughing about it. Granite stones of different sizes lay scattered around the logging camp. One struck a mess tent pole, another landed directly in the center of the fire pit, scattering embers into the dirt. The timing was wrong. The angles were wrong. Stones did not roll downhill into the center of camp. Stones did not arrive only when the forest went quiet. Niels Patterson, the lookout, approached Johan at breakfast. He said he had heard something moving beyond the cutting zone during the night. Something large, slow, deliberate, pushing through brush that should have snapped loudly but did not. Johan said it was a bear. Bears were common this time of year. Preparing for winter, Niels shook his head. He said he knew what bears sounded like. This was not a bear. The work continued anyway. Axes bit into old-growth pine. Trees that had stood for a century fell with thunderous cracks. The forest echoed far longer than it should have, as if sound itself struggled to leave. On the morning of October 23rd, Johan counted 12 stones round the camp perimeter. 12 pieces of granite placed like markers, evenly spaced, deliberate. That same morning, Erik found the tracks. They were not bear tracks, not moose, not deer, not wolf. They were human in shape, but far too large. Johan measured them himself. Each print was nearly 30 centimeters long, broad at the heel, deep in the soil. The stride between them stretched close to 2 meters. Whatever made them walked on 2 legs, whatever made them was tall, very tall. The men gathered round the impressions in silence. No one joked now. No one offered explanations. Later that day, Maddie, one of the Finnish workers, spoke quietly to Johan. He said there were old stories about these forests, stories his grandmother used to tell, stories about places where people were not supposed to cut. Johan told him they did not have time for superstition. They had a quota to meet. They had wagons scheduled. They had orders from the Vermland Timber Company. That night, the forest went unnaturally silent. No wind, no animals, no distant calls, just the faint sound of something large shifting its weight beyond the firelight. Close enough to be felt, too far to be seen. October 27, 1922. Sleep had become impossible at the Vermland logging camp. Stones continued to fall after dark, striking canvas and earth with a regular rhythm. Not enough to destroy the camp, just enough to remind the men that something was nearby. Shortly before dawn, Johan left his tent carrying his rifle. The forest at that hour was neither night nor a day. Everything washed in grey, shapes blurring together between the trunks. He walked the perimeter slowly. Every sound felt louder than it should have. Every step seemed to travel farther than it should have. That was when he saw the shape between the pines. It stood roughly 50 meters from camp, partially obscured by branches, tall beyond reason. At least 3 meters, possibly more. The body was hunched forward. Its arms hung along for its frame, unmoving, watching. Johan raised the rifle, but his hands shook violently. He called out in Swedish, then Norwegian, then Finnish. The words sounded small and fragile in the still air. The shape shifted its weight, not toward him, not away, just enough to reveal its breathing, deep and slow, like bellows. White steam rose from its mouth in the cold. Then it stepped backward, not retreating, simply withdrawing, melting into the shadows without sound. No snapping branches, no footsteps, nothing. Johan stood frozen until full daylight, rifle aimed at empty forest, trying to convince himself that fear had distorted his vision. Later that morning, they found new signs. Scratches carved into the bark of a pine at the edge of camp, long gouges running parallel, set nearly 2 meters up, too high for any man, too deliberate for any animal. The marks were fresh. Sap still oozed from the wounds in the tree. Eric stared at them for a long time before speaking. He said they were old places, places his father and grandfather warned him about, sections of forest where no one cut, not because of law, but because of consequence. Johan dismissed it as superstition, but his voice lacked conviction, because now he had seen it, and the forest no longer felt empty. That night, the men stayed close to the fire. No songs, no stories, only the sound of breathing, and the certainty that something tall and patient stood just beyond the reach of the flames. October 30th, 1922. The damage began subtly at first. A stone tore through the canvas of the mess tent during the night. Another struck the water barrel and split the wood, spilling precious supply into the dirt. By morning, the men were exhausted. Dark circles under their eyes, voices low and strained. Sleep came only in fragments. Always broken by imagined sounds, Niels refused to return to the lookout station. He said it was too exposed, too far from the others. He said whatever was out there watched from above during the day and moved closer when the sun went down. More tracks appeared at the edge of camp, closer than before, deeper in the soil. The same impossible stride, the same massive prints. Johan tried to maintain order. He reminded the men of the quota, of the wagons scheduled to arrive, of the authority of the Vermland Timber Company. But authority carried little weight against fear. That morning, Eric pulled Johan aside. He said the trees here were older than most. that no one had touched the section of old growth for generations, that forests like this were avoided for a reason. Johan told him they were taking the wood. That was the job. Eric nodded slowly, then said they should work fast. That afternoon, the men discovered the saw. One of the long felling saws lay beside a stump. Not broken, not snapped, bent, the steel blade curved in a smooth arc, as if something had taken it in both hands and twisted. Half a centimeter thick, deformed like soft wire. No one spoke for a long time. There was no natural explanation for this, no accident that could account for it. That night, 3 men packed their gear before sunrise. The 2 Norwegians and 1 Finnish worker. They left without argument, choosing the farthest road over another night in camp. Johan watched them disappear between the trees, unsure whether they were escaping danger or walking directly into it. By nightfall, the camp stood quieter than ever. Fewer voices, fewer tents, fewer illusions. And the forest pressed closer, patient and unhurried, as if it knew time was on its side. November 2nd, 1922. With 3 men gone, the logging camp felt exposed. The work continued, but at a slower pace. Axes struck wood with less confidence. Every sound echoed strangely, returning distorted, as if the forest bent it on purpose. That night, as Johan sat writing a letter by lamplight, a sound rose from deep within the trees, low, rhythmic, deliberate, not quite music, not quite speech. It sounded like singing. The men emerged from their tents one by one, standing shoulder to shoulder near the fire, listening as the sound drifted through the ancient forests, coming closer, then pulling away, as if something was circling just beyond sight. The sound continued for nearly 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise. Mary was shaking. He said the stories warned about sounds like that hearing it meant something had noticed you. The next morning, Johan discovered his journal open. He knew he had closed it. He always closed it. But one page was missing, torn cleanly from the binding. The entry describing the tall shape between the pines was gone. No one admitted touching it. No one would meet his eyes. That night, the stones stopped. No impacts. No cracks against canvas. No scattered embers. Just silence. Complete and absolute. Eric said it was gone. That whatever had been watching them had moved on. But Johan knew better. The absence felt deliberate. Like held breath. Like a predator settling into wait. The forest no longer tested them. It observed them. And that made the men more afraid than they had ever been before. November 7th, 1922. The temperature dropped without warning. Not gradually, not with wind or cloud, but suddenly, as if winter itself had stepped closer. The men sat round the fire eating their evening meal. Pea soup and hard bread, the same food they had eaten for weeks. Routine, familiar, almost comforting. Then the fire bent sideways, flames pulling in a direction no wind supported. Breath turned visible in seconds, thick white clouds forming in front of their mouths. And then came the smell. Wet earth, heavy and sour, like soil disturbed after centuries, like a grave opened and left to breathe. The shadow appeared first, cast enormous against the canvas of the tents, stretching far taller than any man. Then it stepped into the firelight. It stood 3.5 meters tall, possibly more. Its body was covered in something dark, fur or moss or both, matted and dripping. Its arms hung past its knees. Its fingers were long, ending in nails dark as old wood. Its face was almost human, but wrong in every proportion. Eyes set too far apart beneath a heavy brow, the flat wide nose, a mouth that split too far back into the face. It stood there in silence, looking at each man in turn, lingering, deciding. When its eyes met Johann's, something cold tightened in his chest. Those eyes were intelligent, aware, judging. The creature reached down and picked up one of the axes, held it as if it weighed nothing, turned it slowly in its hands, examining the blade as firelight glinted across the steel. A low sound rose from its chest, rumbling, vibrating, almost like speech, almost like laughter. Then it dropped the axe, turned away, and walked back into the forest. Trees snapped as it moved. Branches broke under its weight. The sounds faded slowly into the darkness. For a long time, no one spoke. Two men packed their gear that night and left without waiting for dawn, choosing the dark forest over another moment in that camp. And the ones who remained knew whatever lived among those ancient forests was no longer content to watch. It had entered their world, and it had made itself understood.